talking backwards and forwards rather than me just rabbiting on. And one thing I'd say right at the start is the problem with writing a book is before it's even come out, you've changed your ideas. And so don't necessarily believe everything that you read in the book. And it's a real problem, I think, for those of us who do write stuff, that you write at a particular point in time and your ideas. And in fact, the new book that Jose mentioned, that I only just picked up the advanced copy of this morning, so you can see first copy in existence. Already I want to change it. I want to do things differently. I want to add some different things. I went to a conference last week and heard this really interesting thing. Oh, geez, I wish I heard that before in the book. I'd have done it differently. So I think that's really important as we approach any book that anyone's written, to understand that it's always a work in progress, and our ideas always develop, just as your ideas will develop well beyond the time you get your piece of paper from Victoria University. Jose asked me to talk about human rights and community development, because I guess I've been very interested in both of them for a long time, and more recently came to realise how important each is to the other, and how the more you think about them, the more they become two sides of the same thing. In a sense, they're both about our search for our humanity and for realising our humanity. Community development likes to talk about achieving our humanity in community, the notion of human community, and this is where we achieve our humanity, not in splendid isolation as the individual consumer, but actually as a member of a community or of multiple communities. This is where our humanity makes sense. Human rights likes to talk about the idea of the common humanity, the fact that all people around the world share something called humanity, and out of that we can derive notions of rights that everyone should have. And when you think about it, the words human community and common humanity are the same. Common community and human humanity. And really, human rights and community development are about the same thing. They're about achieving our humanity, understanding our humanity. What does that mean? It's fairly easy to argue that community development needs human rights. We know that without some sort of value framework, community development can be very dangerous. I've used the example of the Hitler Youth being a fantastic community development program. It involved young people, it got everyone engaged, gave people a great sense of worth, community development work would be ticking off their KPIs, that sort of, but, in isolation from an understanding of the value, the political context, the human rights implications of what the Hitler Youth was about. And we could talk about the Mao Zedong's Red Guard in the same way. Community development can actually be quite dangerous if we don't have a human rights framework. If you go to a community and say, well, here I am, your community development worker, and the community says, oh, great, can you help us do something about the Aborigines? They're such a nuisance, can you help us to move along? We need a human rights framework around what we're doing in order to say no, and in order to come at those sorts of issues in a way that actually respects people. So it's fairly easy to argue that community development requires human rights. I think one of the things that, however, human rights does give to community development is the importance of valuing diversity. I think one of the dangers of community development is we can get too hooked on this notion of community being about what we hold in common. And building community around commonality can very easily lead to exclusion of those who don't hold the common. And it's the problem of community development built around heritage. We've got this great heritage going back to so and so and so and so. What happens when a refugee family moves into that community? the idea, rather than building community on what we hold in common, the really interesting thing is to build community on our differences. And to say, as Jean-Luc Nancy, the sociologist, says, it's our differences that we have in common. And ultimately what we have in common is our difference. So notion of community in difference rather than community in commonality leads to a much richer community. And I think coping with issues of dealing with issues of diversity and difference is something that actually human rights can bring to community development and help us with. We can also talk about why human rights require community development. And here I think we can start to see some real weaknesses in the traditional way in which we've understood human rights. I think human rights require community. If you think of an individual person stranded on a desert island, they have no rights because there's nobody to meet those rights. There's nobody to meet the obligations, the duties of those rights. You could say they've got a right of freedom of speech, but there's nobody to talk to. They might have a right of freedom of a right to education. What does that mean if you're an individual on a desert island? What does a right to be treated with dignity have to the individual? It's meaningless. Rights only have meaning when we start to see ourselves as connected to others. And the notion of a community of rights and responsibilities where we have rights and we have duties to each other, I think is implied by an idea of human rights. It's nothing to me. There are other people who've argued that too. Which leads us away from that notion of my rights as the individual claiming his individual rights, but says, what about our rights? Rights are things that we hold in common. They only make sense if we think about how we hold them in common and how they're our rights. And I think the traditional sort of way of thinking about human rights has made them very individualised. And the legal frameworks of the United Nations make them very individual. And I think we miss a lot of the aspect that a community development perspective would give us to human rights. If we say, look, rights actually only make sense embedded in community. If we want to strengthen people's rights, we've got to strengthen the communities that they work in. And when you think about human rights as we have them, they tend to be lovely statements of human rights that were made by a few politicians, academics, lawyers. The statements of human rights that we have aren't really statements that we own. We haven't had anything to do with what goes in them. They tend to, in other words, human rights statements, human rights conventions, legislations, bills of rights, whatever, let's talk whether we should have one in Australia, Victorian Charter of Rights and so on, tend to be statements by the powerful about the powerless. And they tend to be a powerful, well-meaning, powerful group telling everybody what their rights are. Now, we could argue that's actually a denial of human rights. Our right to participate in defining our rights. And if we start to think that way, we start to think actually helping people to articulate what rights mean for them and rights in their own experience, what rights are important, can be really, really significant. And you know, there are exercises you can do with community groups around actually getting them to define what they think are important rights, not for them, but for everybody. They come up with their own Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is usually rather different from the traditional one. But that way people start to own rights. They start to look, these are the things that are important for me. And also that notion that we enshrine rights in our day-to-day lives, in our lived experience. When we interact with each other, we make assumptions about our rights and our responsibilities to each other. When I go into the bank, as a